3, 2, 1, fire. This is not my first season. This is not my first time flying Kerbin. And I know that Trinity works and works pretty well.
St. Juan's home for the ADD.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Let's Play Kerbal Space Program, Peculiar Inclination. I'm your host, Quan3217, and in this episode we're going to continue building our orbital class rocket. So now, make sure that we got the 1.25 meter heat shield. Okay, lots of good stuff. Now we can build Crossroads Able. You know, I've always suspected, in fact, I'm going to show you why we have the SimQuan flag. We're going to intentionally not put a heat shield on this thing. I'm going to put 4 T200 fuel tanks on this thing. A swivel, and another coupler, 4 more T200s, another swivel for the main stage. We are going to bolt onto the side of the first stage. We're going to bolt on a pair of Thunderbirds. That's what they're called, yeah, okay. These are not going to be separable. But this is plenty of delta V to get into orbit. I know this because I've tested it in previous flights. So we've got boosters and a main stage. We're going to run this engine at about 50% during the boost in order to gain extra steerage. Then looking up the rocket further, we're going to separate and light the second engine simultaneously, and we're going to do these two things simultaneously. Do we have any nose cones? No, but we do want fins. Yeah, they're weak, but there's some. And then we should be able to put more science on this thing. So we got the pressure gauge. Put a temperature gauge on it. Hook everything up to the science button. We're going to put a pilot in this one. And we're actually going to put our other pilot in there to gain more experience for her. So save. One other thing we're going to do here is, in order to satisfy the peculiar inclination, we are going to rotate the capsule 45 degrees. That way it should be a little easier to hit the peculiar inclination. So when we fly this one, we fly Crossroads Able with Valentina flying the SimQuan flag. So we don't know if this one's going to work. Now, if it does work, we're going to revert the flight as soon as we hit the parachutes. We're not going to land. And if there's any emergency during launch, we are not going to abort the launch. We are going to revert it. So we throttle up to about 50%, turn on Valentina's SAS, and then 3, 2, 1, hip hip. start doing our normal gravity turn, or our pre-gravity turn. I like to go up, if the rocket can do it, I like to go about every 100 meters per second we're going faster. I like to go about 10 degrees pitched over, but it doesn't look like this rocket has quite enough steerage in order to be able to do it. So. But I'm quite confident that there's enough delta V on board this rocket in order to get it into space. Even though we're decelerating now we're accelerating. We've got the main stage back on full throttle. And we're not picking up speed very fast. We're just barely over 1g acceleration. But notice our apoapse is still climbing. And that's all we need. So we're going to keep pitching down. Like, we're going to let the fins fly us for a while. That's how you know you got a true gravity turn, is when you can just let the fins control you. So then we reach the end of that stage, drop it off, like the next stage. Now we got to keep it under control because we don't have a fin. But we're going to cut off the second stage when we get up to about 75 kilometers of apoapse. Just like that. That may be a little high, but it's okay. And then we're going to do the usual Kerbal thing of coast up to apoapse. And just before we get there, we are going to fire our engines and try to circularize. Now, if this is done just right, we won't have to point either up or down. We can point straight at the horizon. Unfortunately, just right requires planning and maneuver, and we don't have that technology yet. But look at all that delta V we've got left. We could probably get to the moon with this. I'm not going to this time. But it's nice to know that we could if we wanted to. So we're going to get our apoapse is 76 and some kilometers. At 75 kilometers, we're going to fire up the engines. And accelerate into a circular low Kerbin orbit. Watching the vertical speed up here because we want it to be, ideally we want it to be 0 just as this goes above 70 kilometers, but didn't quite accomplish that, but we're close enough. We are definitely in orbit. And my usual tradition is that even though the contract has been accomplished and we count as being in orbit as soon as our periapse is high enough, I always like to give our guys at least one complete orbit. So there's all of our contracts, but because we are flying the Sim Quan flag, we're going to be giving all of that back. Yep. SimQuan is basically, this is let's pretend, so it's run out at the astronaut complex, and Valentina is just sitting in a motion-based simulator and flying an imaginary rocket. And so since that's the case, we're going to, she's already got her experience in order to be able to do retrograde. So we're going to immediately deorbit because it's a test flight. But we're going to come in still pretty fast, pretty shallow. Mostly to see what the Mark 1 capsule is like without any heat shield. To see if we really need one for a Crossroads Able. So, separate from the booster. Put us into surface retrograde orientation. Take some science. We're not going to get to keep this science, but we'll just practice taking it. Now for the critical part of the experiment. And if I had a nickel for every time you guys killed me in this thing, I wouldn't need to work for you, Deke. Yeah, this is an interesting speed right here because I haven't mentioned yet in this season, but I'm not a rocket scientist, but I work for rocket scientists. And so one of the projects that I participated in was a sounding rocket, which is very much like Trinity, except that it is unmanned and it was a bit more powerful and is able to get up to 285 kilometers. And it got up to Mach 7 at the end of its second stage engine burn, which is about 1 minute after launch. And Mach 7 pointed straight up is about 2,100 meters per second, in fact. So it's enough to go straight up out of the atmosphere all the way up to 285 kilometers. But then it's not going sideways fast enough, so it falls back down, and it only stays in space for about 5 minutes? But that was long enough for us to perform our experiment. So, are we getting hot? How can we tell if we're getting hot? Oh, our experiments are already heating up. Let's see if you're going to be smiling here in a minute, Val. But our sounding rocket was just made out of aluminum. And it was maybe a 1/4 inch thick aluminum body shell. But when it came down, it was perfectly well able to survive the heat pulse coming down into re-entry, coming down, going from Mach 7 to pretty close to 0 speed. And it actually did all of that in just like 30 seconds. So it's pretty much like hitting a wall as far as hitting the upper atmosphere. So we'll see if this Mark 1 capsule is as strong as the aluminum can we use for a sounding rocket. Probably going to lose our experiments, but we don't get to keep the science anyway, so it doesn't matter. See, now this is actually what I would consider to be rocket science. We're performing an experiment with a rocket, and the experiment is I hypothesize that I do not need a heat shield in order to survive entry from low Kerbin orbit. And it appears that my hypothesis is confirmed because we're through the heat pulse. And that's really all the data we need. So we will revert the flight. This time we're gonna give it to Val again, and we're gonna fly it under the proper flag. Okay, throttle up to about 50%. Turn on stabilization. Check your staging. 3, 2, 1, go. We're going to be a little bit more aggressive on the pre-gravity turn this time. See if we can hit the 10 degrees for every 100 meters. So we got to hit 70 degrees right about 200 meters per second. And we want 60 degrees by 300 meters per second. And then we'll call it good. Now we're going to keep pitching. Boosters are burned out, so we throttle up the main engine here again. And now we're in our gravity turn, and we'll let the fins fly us for a while. I planned this one to be a little bit less lofted than the last one. And I don't know if it is or not, but we're just going to keep pointing it down a little bit. Yeah, it's a little bit less lofted because we can see already that we're starting to heat up here. So again, we're going to cut off the engines. We're going to cut it off at about 72 kilometers this time. That's what I like to aim for. Right at 72 kilometers. But because I aimed for 72 kilometers, I always end up a little bit higher than that. So it looks like we're carrying a bit more speed than we did last time, which means that this lower, less lofted trajectory was a better boost. Now I keep on racking up all those world's first. So this time we're going to fire right as we pass through 72 kilometers. And welcome to space. 71, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're going to let it go a little longer. 9, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we'll hit it. Right at the horizon, and otherwise right along prograde. We want this to hit 0 right as we cut off, right as periaps goes above 70 kilometers. Oh, we're not quite there. So, because, now this is interesting, you'll notice our periaps is still just barely in the atmosphere, so we don't count as being in orbit yet. What I'm doing right now is I'm pointing down because right now we're actually going up quite a bit. If we were going level, we would be at periaps at this altitude. So we're going to fire our engines pointing straight down in order to raise our periaps. Think about that for a bit. And there we go. Valentina Kerbin, you've just orbited Kerbal. What are you going to do next? I'm going to Disney World. As soon as I get down. And I think that'll do it for this episode. I'm going to learn all about the wonderful world of editing video in Linux and posting videos to YouTube from Linux. And we'll see how that goes. And if you're watching this, that means it worked. This has been Quan3217 saying, if at first you don't succeed, fly, fly again. Get that cool selfie for our collection back at the astronaut complex.